better get my here. So just a few quotes to start with. Al Gore, the future whispers, but the present shouts. Warren Buffett, the American financier, when human politicians choose between the next election and the next generation, it's clear what usually happens. And Jose Manuel Barroso, European Union, we cannot face the future with the tools of the past. So I want to really talk about good governance very briefly, the risks to good governance, and then introduce this concept of anticipatory governance, say just a little bit about its origins, definition, attributes, and how we might assess the quality of anticipatory governance, particularly in advanced democracies like me. We're happy to address questions, obviously, when we have a chance for that. And just by way of background, I've been working particularly on climate change issues and child poverty issues over the last decade or so. They're very different issues, but they do have one thing in common, which is that they involve a need for us to invest now in order to generate better outcomes in the future. In the case of climate change, obviously reduce risks and damage. So I've been quite focused on the whole question of how do we enhance the capacity of democratic political systems to anticipate the future and protect future interests. And looks like we've got sort of a bird strike challenge here, doesn't it? All right. So let's get underway. All right. As many of you will be aware, there's a very large and growing literature on the subject of governance. Governance is fundamentally about steering, about oversight, about prioritization, and so on, and many related ideas. There are many, many different types of governance, so you'll find people talking about collaborative governance, adaptive governance, anticipatory governance, network governance, participatory governance, regulatory governance, and so on and so on. But amidst all that, there's this notion of good governance. And good governance has many attributes, which include, obviously, effectiveness and efficiency, responsiveness, transparency and accountability, honesty, which seems to be sadly lacking in the Trump administration, prudence, resilience, sustainability, and so forth. But last year, but certainly not least, looking forward, having an anticipatory dimension, looking to see what's coming at us, if you like, from the future. So to have good governance, you need good anticipatory mechanisms. Obviously, good public governance is critically important for protecting future interests as well as current interests. Many vital public and private interests can't be adequately protected without wise use of public power. So, is that going to work? Okay. We're all mindful, of course, that we don't always have good governance. There are many examples of bad governance, and there are many causes of such bad governance. I've just listed here some of the many causes of bad governance, but they include problems with the democratic process. On the demand side, excessive demand for some things, inadequate demand for others. We have supply side problems as well, or management of governmental systems and processes. We have, obviously, societal complex and polarization, which can prevent good governance. The issue of trust is critically important. One of the really important issues of the last few decades has been a decline in social and political trust in many democracies, and that's very worrying for the future. We can't. It's much more difficult to make good long-term decisions if people don't trust each other. Other causes of poor governance include, obviously, weak civil society organisations, a loss of confidence in the truth, corrupt practices. Present is bias in policy making, which I'll come back to in a moment. Weak foresight, and of course the fact that we face many wicked problems, or problems towards the wicked end of the spectrum, which are inherently difficult to solve. Okay. One of the contributors to poor governance is what can be called the president's bias. Other people call it short-termism, democratic myopia. There's various terms for it. The notion here is the tendency for governments, and I'm focusing here primarily on democratic governments, but it's certainly limited to democratic governments. The tendency for democratic governments to prioritise short-term interests over long-term interests. And there are many, many examples of that, which include the prioritisation of policy options with positive short-term electoral payoffs at the expense of longer-term interests, the inadequate focus on so-called creeping problems or slow burner problems. I'll come back to that in a sec. Inadequate policy investment, in other words, unwillingness to make difficult or hard political choices now, whether they be fiscal or regulatory or other decisions in order to protect future interests. A commitment to, in fact, unsustainable policy settings, maybe fiscally unsustainable, environmentally unsustainable because of the costs of political costs of making policy changes, or because of a lack of foresight, or ignorance, or simply denial of the truth, and a limited investment in foresight and weak anticipatory governance, which we'll talk about more. So the problem of a presentist bias is particularly prominent in certain policy contexts, especially where governments need to invest now in order to protect the future, and when those investments are electorally challenging. What are some of the causes of the presentist bias? Well, there are many. I'm not going to go through all these in detail, but they include the human condition, our tendency to be impatient, be narrowly self-interested, having cognitive biases, being in a context of bounded rationality. Obviously, the problem of uncertainty, particularly deep uncertainty, can be a challenge for predicting the future. There are all sorts of institutional and political factors which tend to reinforce a presentist bias. They include the fact that future generations don't have a vote, so unless we vote to protect their interests, they can't protect their interests. Short electoral cycles contribute to a presentist bias. Weak international institutions to protect global public goods is another problem. Conflicts of values, which make it very difficult for us to agree on particular courses of action. The way we design our policy frameworks, the way we design our accounting frameworks and so on, which may prioritise certain outcomes and performance measures over the expense of others, which tends to intensify a presentist bias and so on. These are complex matters, and I haven't got time to go into them, but very happy to come back to them. Creeping problems. Creeping problems are a classic area where there's a very high risk of a presentist bias. Creeping problems are those where you basically have sort of slow, gradual deterioration or slow onset of a problem, where there may be tipping points, but they're unclear, and they're typically distant, and therefore they don't invite significant public attention. These problems often have low public visibility. The changes are imperceptible, so they attract little public and media attention. There aren't many focusing events, and maybe the focusing events are not adequately focused upon. There may be some scientific uncertainty, and the time horizons may be very long, and thus people may simply not take that into their calculus. So there are masses of creeping problems, and many of you in this room are dealing with some of them. They include everything from long-term demographic change to increasing income and wealth inequality, spreading obesity, pandemic, increasing incidence of antimicrobial resistance, climate change, etc., etc., etc. And these creeping problems are really ones that we need to be very, very focused on, because they're the ones that typically the public are not focused on, and yet they can have huge long-term and damaging implications. Now I want to come to the concept of anticipatory governance and try and tease that out a little bit and see to what extent it might be helpful for people here involved in various research programs. So a bit of background. The idea of anticipation has been long used in public discourse, but the idea of anticipatory governance has not. Alvin Toffler wrote a book called Future Shock, which many of you may remember, back in the 1970s. He talked about anticipatory governance, in which he focused particularly on participative modes of governance. Several decades later, Americans David Osborne and Ted Gabler wrote a quite seminal book called Reinventing Government, which had a chapter devoted to anticipatory government, which was focused on the idea that prevention is better than cure. And around the same time, a Canadian master's student wrote a thesis about anticipatory governance, and that's the earliest I'm aware of where that concept was used. But since then, it's kind of taken off slowly but surely, and it's been applied to a variety of different policy domains, not least national security, future studies, science and technology studies, planning, complexity, sustainability studies, and climate change. And some of you who are involved in climate change issues will be aware that the notion of anticipatory governance is being used by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and figured in some of the related literature. So it's a concept that's sort of growing, but there's no agreed definition, no agreed set of attributes, and I would say perhaps a little bit of sort of model. And maybe I'm at risk of contributing to that model, but I've written a little bit about this subject. So let me just quickly comment. One of the main contributors to the debate, David Gunson, has described anticipatory governance as follows. He says, a broadly based capacity extended through society that can act on a variety of inputs to manage emerging knowledge-based technologies while such management is still possible. So his focus on anticipatory governance is very much focused on, if you like, the technology assessment, science and technology, that sort of area. My view is that that's too limited, that the concept of anticipatory governance can be applied really to any policy domain, and indeed can be applied not just to the public sector but to the private sector. So my suggestion by way of definition is somewhat broader. I've suggested it should be seen as a system of institutions, rules and norms that encourages the use of evidence, analysis and foresight to manage and reduce risk, as well as identifying opportunities for improvement and increase the system's resilience and capacity for precautionary, proactive, preventative and adaptive interventions in the context of complexity, uncertainty and evolving needs. Now, that's a bit of a mouthful. One could spend a long time teasing that out. Let me just suggest that at the moment and then turn to what I think are some of the core attributes of anticipatory governance, bearing in mind the various contributions of other scholars over the last couple of decades who have used this concept. And I've suggested here that there are 8 key attributes. I'm just very quickly going through them. They include fundamentally an emphasis on foresight and related sort of techniques. So there's a range of foresight techniques, scenario analysis, horizon scanning, etc., etc. If you're going to take an anticipatory approach, well, then you have to be looking forward, not just backwards. It seems to me that an anticipatory approach is going to put a strong emphasis on caution. I appreciate the precautionary approach, precautionary principle and so on is controversial. There are many, many variants of it. But I would want to argue that an anticipatory approach is probably going to have a relatively strong kind of a precautionary principle rather than a weak one. What is suggested, an anticipatory approach is going to emphasize proactive policy interventions, not just sort of reaction. It's going to have a systems approach, so one's going to be thinking holistically. It's going to embrace the notion of adaptive management, indeed adaptive governance. It's going to place a strong emphasis on resilience and sustainability. It's going to support participatory modes of governance and decision making because of the value that participation makes to us identifying the issues that are coming at us from the future and giving us greater capacity to manage and respond to those issues. Much easier if you have public ownership of issues rather than simply trying to sort of top-down impose solutions. And finally, though I think this is really fundamentally important, an anticipatory approach is going to seek to embed long-term interests in day-to-day decision-making at all levels of government and across all policy domains. So this notion of embeddedness, trying to embed future interests in current day-to-day processes, a variety of ways of doing that. But think about, our accounting frameworks, our policy frameworks. Think about, for example, the Treasury's move away from a strong focus on flow measures like GDP to an emphasis on stocks, capital stocks, a whole range of capital stocks, and assessing performance against a range of measures. Okay, so how might we assess the quality of anticipatory governance? Now, I think you all have a copy of an article I've written on anticipatory governance. In that article, there is a very long table in which I have sought to identify what I see as the sort of core criteria that we could try and use to assess the extent to which we are adopting an anticipatory governance approach. In other words, sort of performance measures to assess the quality of anticipatory governance. And the 7 categories of criteria that I've identified, there's overarching principles, there's principles in relation to planning processes and foresight, there's principles in relation to policy and regulatory frameworks, there's criteria in relation to the representation of future interests, providing, ensuring we have institutions that are designed to exercise a voice on behalf of future interests, for example, the environment, children, and so on. Another set of criteria relate to particular performance measures we might choose and the way they're reported on. A 6th set of criteria relate to issues of resilience, risk reduction, and emergency management. And the 7th relate to measures for problem solving and consensus building in relation to long-term policy challenges, including obviously creeping problems. So there isn't time to go through all those criteria here and now, but I just invite you to have a look at the criteria I've suggested, and I really welcome any feedback on that. From my point of view, this is very much an emerging area in which, well, the more people that apply themselves to thinking about this, the better. Another way of looking at it is to say this is just bringing a different sort of lens to issues that you might have been addressing with a different lens. Well, I hope this is a helpful lens. So it may be that some of the criteria I've suggested are not very helpful, or that there are better ones, or there's additional categories that I haven't adequately thought of. So in the remaining time, let me just say a few other things. First of all, adaptive governance and how that relates to anticipatory governance. Well, Kirsten has already introduced the concept of adaptive governance. There are a variety of definitions. Mostly, as you will be aware, I think, and this came through in the previous presentation, adaptive governance has been applied particularly to sort of ecosystem-based management, particularly to environmental management, resource management, and so on. But there's no reason why the notion of adaptive governance couldn't be applied more broadly. The idea that we should build flexibility and adaptiveness into our institutional arrangements, that we should take very seriously the problems of complexity and uncertainty and risk management and so on, those are relevant to all policy domains, or at least most policy domains. So there's no reason to limit adaptive governance to one particular domain. In my view, adaptive governance could be seen as a part of anticipatory governance, or it could be as a separate but overlapping category. I'm not wanting to be an essentialist about this. Very happy to entertain a range of ways of sort of viewing these two concepts and how they interact. How might we enhance the quality of anticipatory governance? Now, there's another table that I hope is being distributed. It's just a one-page table which outlines a series of proposed reforms in New Zealand to enhance the quality of anticipatory governance in this particular jurisdiction. Many of these things, however, would be relevant in other jurisdictions around the world. So I proposed several constitutional changes which I think would enhance our capacity for anticipatory governance. One of the most obvious is to extend the parliamentary term. We have a very short parliamentary term in New Zealand, and that I think tends to truncate people's temporal lens. Changing to 4 years isn't going to make a radical difference, but it would help. If we had a proper entrenched constitution, we could build into it environmental rights. We could, of course, build such rights into our Bill of Rights Act as it stands, though our current Act, of course, is an ordinary statute, so it can be readily overridden. I've suggested various changes to enhance long-term reporting, including having a Social Reporting Act parallel to an Environmental Reporting Act, a Long-Term Reporting Act, a Risk Reporting Act, and so on and so on. I've suggested ways we could improve the foresight capacity. New Zealand has no dedicated centralised foresight capacity within government at the moment, unlike the situation in many other jurisdictions. I think it would be helpful to have one. I also think it would be helpful to have greater foresight capacity within our parliament. The Finnish Parliament has a committee dedicated to future issues. No reason why we couldn't do likewise. I've suggested ways in which we could improve and strengthen our existing future-focused institutions and perhaps extend the range of those institutions. I've suggested various ways in which we could attempt to embed the future more fully within current policy frameworks, and in which we could nurture a more future-focused political culture and improve our environmental stewardship and productive governance. And again, very happy to talk about some of the ideas listed on that table later on or at another occasion. How am I going for time?
We've got 3 more minutes.
3 minutes, brilliant. Okay, right. Well, there we are. We'll be within budget. Final point is just to highlight how the concept of anticipatory governance might be applied to one specific policy area, namely climate change adaptation. Judy Lawrence and I have recently completed a working paper on this topic. It's available online. I'm very happy to make it available to people if you have any difficulty finding it. Judy is currently chairing the government's technical working group on climate change adaptation. What we've done in this paper is to focus on the question: how can we most efficiently and effectively fund the inevitable costs of sea level rise over the coming century and beyond? There's no question we're going to have sea level rise. We may not know the speed or the magnitude fully, but we certainly know the direction. We know that lots and lots of people are going to be displaced. We also know that if we don't provide appropriate institutional arrangements, both in terms of planning and funding, then we're going to have a lot of resistance from people, which may well end up in bad planning and investment in protective structures that are not cost effective and not permanent. So what we propose in this paper, recognizing the things that we can anticipate, namely sea level rise, strong public resistance in the absence of compensation for the fact that many subnational governments lack the resources to manage the scale of the problem, that insurance companies are simply going to walk away as the problem gets greater, and that legal processes can't be relied upon to ensure just outcomes. We propose that we establish a body similar to EQC, which is a post-disaster body. We're proposing a pre-disaster body, funding body, a publicly funded body that will essentially provide the resources necessary to facilitate efficient and effective, as well as equitable, managed retreat from coastlines that are vulnerable to sea level rise. That's about as much as I can say in a couple of minutes. It's a complex area. It's going to be increasingly controversial over the coming decades, but with a bit of sort of foresight and anticipation, we can think, I think, through the kinds of problems we're going to face and come up with institutional solutions, or at least part solutions, that will help us manage that process, along with many other challenges that climate change is going to impose on us. So finally, just to summarise, anticipatory governance, in my view, is an important attribute of good governance. We should be seeking to have the very best type of governance we can at all levels within society. Anticipatory governance, in my view, has a variety of attributes. I've sought to outline what I think they are. We can assess the quality of anticipatory governance. We can enhance it. We should. And there's various reforms that I propose that I think would help to improve the quality of anticipatory governance here in New Zealand and potentially in all other democratic regimes around the world. So thank you very much. I'm sorry if I've gone through that very quickly, but I hope I've given you a reasonable overview and ready your appetite. And I hope something of what I've said is useful for various research projects that you're involved in. Thank you very much.